Content warning. Discussions of violence, war, torture and death that some people may find disturbing.
Welcome to the Newcastle Witches Podcast. Thank you for listening. This is episode 3, Civil Newcastle, part 2.
So, bad things are happening in Newcastle. They've had the plague. People are being punished and people are talking about how corrupt the government is. We've got Ralph Gardner, for instance. What else is happening after the plague? What else is kind of going on in Newcastle?
So the big one, of course, in the run-up to the witch trials, the thing that looms the largest probably is going to be the Civil War. And we talk about the English Civil War as if it's kind of one thing. Actually, historians don't normally talk about the English Civil War as a thing anymore. They normally talk about the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. These are a series of civil wars between the various nations that made up what they would describe as something like the Commonwealth at the time. So by that they mean really the Kingdom of England, the Kingdom of Scotland. So Wales would be included under the English crown at the time. The Kings of England ruled Wales. And they also claimed to be the rulers of Ireland. That was heavily contested by the Irish at the time. So yeah, Ireland and Scotland are heavily involved in this series of civil wars as well. And they quickly get very, very complicated. Everyone has their own agendas. Everyone has their own reasons for going to war. And there are actually several different wars that are part of these. So the first one that affects Newcastle really is in 1640. It's actually before the main civil war kicks off. And is known as the Bishops' War. So King Charles, he's the King of England and the King of Scotland. So he is, but they are both separate countries with they have separate parliaments and separate governments and separate religions. So the official religion of England is the Church of England, which Charles is the head of because he's the king, and the king is the head of the Church of England.
Yep.
And the main religion in Scotland is Presbyterianism, or the Church of Scotland, which is not, the king is not the head of that. It's a much more loose organisation of quite strictly Protestant churches. These are, in England, they would probably be termed Puritans or something like that, but they don't have that kind of terminology up in Scotland. And because this quickly gets very confusing for the king as much as anyone else, King Charles tries to kind of impose English styles of religion on the Scots. He wants them to adopt an English prayer book, have bishops, which is very much the way the Church of England does things. And to the Scots, this is next to Catholicism, which is like the big bad of the period. Yeah. I mean, if you looked at conspiracy theories nowadays, who are the targets of conspiracy theories? There's always, it's George Soros plotting everything, all this kind of stuff that you see on the internet. The Pope is the George Soros of the 17th century in Britain. The Protestant communities in Europe very much saw kind of Catholic conspiracies everywhere. There was a lot of religious conflict going on. So, I mean, Europe was in the throes of the 30 Years' War at this time, which is a huge religious war going on in Germany, which lots of Scots were fighting in on the Protestant side. So they had come back very much radicalized, you might say. They were very, very strictly Protestant, very anti-Catholic. And when the king tries to impose these bishops and prayer books and things on them, they do not like it. They rise up in rebellion against the king and they invade England. The army of Scotland, the National Army, marches south and actually invades England. And this is known as the Army of the Solemn League and Covenant.
And so their first stop, Newcastle.
And their first stop is Newcastle. They march south and they encounter the king's army at a place called Newburn, which is it's just a suburb of Newcastle now, but there was a ford there, Newburn Ford, where you could cross the River Tyne, and the king's army tries to stop the Scots crossing the river so that they can't get any further south into England. But the king's army is largely local militias armed with decades-old weapons, completely untrained, whereas the Scots army is largely consisting of mercenaries who've spent the last decade fighting in brutal religious wars in Scotland, and the battle goes about as well for the English as you would expect it to in those circumstances. They're completely routed, flee the battlefield, and the Scots actually occupy Newcastle. And it's not a brutal occupation, but they do a lot of damage. I mean, the church, for example, the cathedral, the font in Newcastle's cathedral there's a story that it was dismantled at that time by a local mason to hide it from the Scots. Because they were worried that the Scots, being, as I say, very strict Presbyterians, they weren't keen on all of the high church trappings that you would have found in a typical English church in that period. So they're often associated with smashing stained glass windows, breaking fonts and altars and things like that. So doing serious damage to churches. The town doesn't try to defend itself at this stage. They occupy the town pretty bloodlessly. There's not a large battle or anything in 1640, but they do occupy the town, and the king is made to pay them a massive fee to get them to go away again. Basically, that's how that ends. The king says, "Look, all right, I won't make you have English prayer books, and here's a big wad of cash."
Oh, wow.
Which they would say is, well, we've marched all the way down here, we need to pay our soldiers and so on. But it's a bribe. I mean, they're bribed to leave Newcastle. But it can't have been good for the morale of the town, I wouldn't have thought.
No.
That would have been the first time that Newcastle had ever fallen to a Scottish army or attack. It had defended itself successfully throughout the medieval period. It had been under siege a lot. Throughout the 13 and 1400s, Newcastle was regularly besieged by Scottish armies and successfully defended itself. So this must have been a pretty humiliating blow, I think, to the people of the town. It might have exacerbated a lot of the religious tension that you would find as well. Because that tension between high church and low church, or sort of different branches of Protestantism, is repeated throughout England as well. So there are the people called Puritans in England who would see themselves as very strict Protestants, and they would see that the Church of England is a corrupt organisation that's very close to Catholicism. And most major towns would have some Puritans living in them. They were a significant kind of religious minority, but they were not in charge in Newcastle.
When do they become in charge of Newcastle?
So that is after the Civil War proper. So the Battle of Newburn Ford is a kind of prelude to the main Civil War. The King of England had always at that stage, or from the medieval period onwards, had to summon Parliament to raise taxes. They couldn't just raise taxes themselves. And I don't just mean raise taxes as in put them up. I mean get taxes at all.
Oh.
The general way that you raise taxes, there was no income tax in the Middle Ages or the 17th century. If the king was going to war and needed a tax, he would impose like an income tax or a property tax or a poll tax, and they would collect a certain amount of money for every person, 10% of your income or something like that in 1 year. But you didn't regularly pay that. It wasn't like nowadays where you pay 20% of your income to the government whenever you get your paycheck. It was every time the king wanted taxes, he had to go to Parliament and say, I want to make a tax to get some cash to go to war with France.
Right, okay.
And having spent lots of money fighting his own people, the Scots, he is also the King of Scots, when he next goes to Parliament trying to raise a tax, they refuse. There's a big falling out, which is a minor way of putting it, because it kicks off into a civil war, which ends up as one of the most devastating conflicts in British history, really. Lasts for about 10 years and causes massive damage to the country. I mean, tens of thousands of people are killed. Some estimates are that something like between 10 and 20% of the population of England are killed or displaced during this conflict. The local populations are raised into the armies of the various sides. So Newcastle raises a large regiment, 3,000 men are taken from Newcastle by the Duke of Newcastle, and he forms a regiment for the King's army.
What year was this happening?
So this
in the
is
start?
1642. This really kind of kicks off.
Yeah.
And Newcastle is very much on the royalist side.
Mm-hmm.
So Newcastle's mayor, John Marley, and most of the local gentry, I suppose, are very much on the king's side. They're part of the royalist strongholds in the north that hold out for the king against Parliament. Parliament's stronghold really is in London. That's where they're strongest. The king is based in Oxford for most of the war, but has a big block of support in the north around York. And in 1644, there's a large battle fought near York at a place called Marston Moor, where the king's armies in the north are defeated decisively by a combination of the Army of Parliament and the Scottish army, who they've made an alliance with. So this is a kind of joint army of Parliament and Scotland against the king, and the king's army is beaten. Most of the king's supporters from the north of England, at this stage, some of them go into exile in France. They actually leave the country, they abandon the king's cause. And there is now no realistic kind of army in the north fighting for the king. And from there, the Scottish army marches north and takes various towns and cities on its way. So York falls very quickly after the battle, it surrenders. And Parliament encourages them to lay siege to Newcastle. London, by this point, is really reliant on coal from Newcastle to heat itself. They're not burning so much wood in London anymore because the population's too large. And most of the coal in the country is coming from Newcastle. So they really want to get Newcastle fast so that they can restart those shipments of coal, because they're worried that it's going to be a cold winter in 1644. And the battle's quite late in the year, so it's summer before the battle's fought, so they don't have too long to capture the town. And the Scots march north and they lay siege to Newcastle in 1644. They completely surround the town and begin bombarding it with their artillery, trying to batter the walls down, and of course trying to make the people within the town surrender. That's really the focus of any siege. Most attacking armies don't actually want to have to storm a town or anything like that. It's hugely dangerous, especially one with walls as large and well fortified as Newcastle's. So they would like the people inside to surrender. And they think that's a pretty sure thing because there's no army that's going to come and relieve them. There are no royalist armies in the north. There's nobody who's going to come and rescue them. But the town holds out. So the town's mayor refuses to negotiate. This is a guy called John Marley.
So he just flatly denies them entry into. He just says no.
Yeah, he's probably got a few soldiers in the town, and he's got the town's population who are fighting with whatever weapons they can get, muskets, but also probably older stuff like crossbows. We're told about clubs with nails through them,
which aren't very useful if the people are standing on the other side of the wall with cannons.
No, but once they start to come through the walls or trying to come through the gates, they can cause some serious damage. And actually, the Scots have a writer with them. It's one of the reasons that we know so much about the siege. The Scots actually have a guy called William Lithgow travelling with them, who's a Scottish writer. He's a travel writer. He travelled all over Europe and the Middle East and North Africa and places. But he was with the Scottish army at the Siege of Newcastle, and he writes an eyewitness account. And he says that the enemy did more damage with Herculean clubs than with hand grenades or shot. It was a nasty conflict, certainly, and the town was in dire straits throughout the siege. I mean, it was surrounded, it was cut off from any supplies.
How long did this last?
So this lasted from, I think it's July through to October. So it's several months, which is an incredible amount of time to hold out with no real support. The Scots were attacking forts further down the river, so they took South Shields. So they were able to block ships from coming up the river, so they couldn't bring supplies in from the sea. They blocked off all of the major roads, occupied the towns around, so Elsick, Benwell, Gateshead, were all occupied by Scottish forces. Sunderland was occupied at that time as well. But yeah, the town is besieged for a long period of time. People are cut off from any supplies of food, they're starving. And in the end, the Scots are forced to storm the town in October. So October the 19th, they detonate mines that they've dug under the walls. So they get miners from Elsick, Benwell, and some of the towns in the West End to dig under the walls of Newcastle. They pull the foundations of the stone walls out, replace these with kind of wooden props so that the walls stay up long enough for you to get out of your little tunnel. But then they pack them with barrels of gunpowder, and at a given signal on that morning, they detonate them all at the same time. They blow the walls sky high, basically. And then they storm the town. So they actually attack these breaches in the wall with their soldiers and just storm the town, storm through the gaps.
But there's no real soldiers inside, So who are they?
Well, there certainly are people defending the town. So there are a few soldiers, or at least armed citizens of the town to defend them. Again, Lithgow talks about musket balls flying into the faces of Scottish soldiers as thick as hailstones as they come through the breach. You've got to think these are very narrow gaps. You're able to concentrate a lot of fire on those, and they're trying to push through this into the town. And we're told that there is, in one of my favourite quotes, that there's fierce fighting in the big market. It's that mention of the big market, which is the central marketplace of the town, and it was there was hand-to-hand fighting in the streets of the town until at last one of the soldiers in the town, one of the commanders of the town, lays down his sword. He surrenders the town to the Scots. The mayor is nowhere to be seen by this point. He's actually hiding in the castle, which has been his command post. He's had cannon mounted in the castle. He's had it refortified, and he basically locks himself in the castle as the town falls around him. The Scots take the town, ring the church bells as sort of sign of victory. But Marley is still holed up in his fortress inside the castle of Newcastle in the keep until about 3 or 4 days later he's forced to surrender. He hasn't actually stocked the castle for a siege, so he has no supplies or food. And he tries at this stage to negotiate with the Scots to say, well, can me and my men march out of this town? And he's flatly told, no. You had your chance to negotiate, mate, and it was 4 months ago. We've just stormed this town.
Yeah.
And Marley is actually locked up in the dungeon of the castle. He's thrown into the prison at the basement of the castle keep, which is at the time the county jail for Northumberland. And Lithgow certainly thinks he's going to be executed. He says to await the headsman. So he imagines that Marley is going to be executed. In the event, Marley is a far too slippery a customer for that. He escapes and gets to France, where he joins the king's son and other royalist supporters in exile eventually after the Civil War, and comes back when, during the Restoration, he actually reappears and becomes mayor of Newcastle again. So he has a good few years in France after the Civil War. So 1644, the Scots occupy Newcastle. It's one of their strongholds in the north. And actually, eventually, within 2 years of that, 1646, King Charles comes north and surrenders himself to the Scots. He thinks they'll treat him better than Parliament. And he's imprisoned in Newcastle for about a year or so. Quite a comfortable imprisonment, I think. He's in a place called Anderson House, which is around where Eldon Square is nowadays, a huge mansion house with gardens and things surrounding it. It's very distinctive on early maps of Newcastle, and he's under house arrest in there. And there's all sorts of stories that he went out to Shieldfield to play golf.
I heard this story.
Yeah,
Is
he
it
used to be
true?
allowed onto the river. Well, we don't really know, I don't think. I mean, there's no primary source for those things from the time, so we can take them with a pinch of salt. But I think he was under fairly comfortable imprisonment to begin with. And he also went to St Nicholas Church, so the cathedral in Newcastle now. It wasn't the cathedral then, it was just one of the parish churches. We're told one of the Scottish preachers would sort of continuously harangue poor Charles while he was in church. He was made to go to these church services where this Scottish preacher would preach about the wickedness of evil kings and tyrants and things like this from the Bible, and with a clear kind of eye on poor old Charles.
Just forced to go to church where he's just being told off the entire time.
Basically, yeah. That's roughly how it goes. It gets worse for him though, because
It does get worse for him.
Yeah, the Scots sell him basically to Parliament.
Oh.
So they sell him to the English Parliament effectively.
So he ran away from Parliament, hoping to get a better outcome.
Yeah.
To then get sold back to Parliament.
And then get sold back to Parliament. The
And
Scots
then he gets
hand him
beheaded.
over to Parliament, and he is put on trial. And I mean, to cut a very long story short, because there's a huge amount you could say about his trial, but he's put on trial for high treason. This is a huge change in the way the country runs. I mean, the idea of a king being put on trial for treason almost doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make sense.
But he was accused of being the enemy of the Commonwealth, of the people. And Parliament blamed him for this bloody war that had destroyed so much of the country, and said, by trying to continue this war, by refusing to surrender and come to reasonable terms with Parliament, he is prolonging the war, and he is therefore an enemy of the people of England, Scotland, Ireland, and is therefore a traitor to his own country. And Charles is executed in London in January 1650.
Oh.
So this is kind of around the same time as the witch trials are happening, between 1649 and 1650 is the time when Charles himself is on trial, and takes us past the time of his execution. And again, I don't think you can overestimate just the kind of shockwaves that sends through the community in Newcastle and England and Scotland more widely. I mean, I think Europe-wide, it was unprecedented for a people to overthrow their own king and execute him.
Yeah.
And then have no king to replace him with either.
Yeah, so who's going to step in now? And I guess that creates a huge power vacuum, and people are going to be opportunists.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Parliament takes over the rule of the country when the king is executed. And in Newcastle, the old town corporation, who were strongly royalist, in fact, Lithgow calls them malignants, papists, or even atheists. It's like in order of badness, like the three worst things he can think
Those
of
dirty
you
atheists.
could possibly be. He's like, that's even worse than being a Catholic, which is slightly worse than being a malignant, a royalist. But the old town corporation, who are royalist, are removed, or they're dead because they've been killed in the siege, and they're replaced by a sort of Puritan council loyal to Parliament. So the town corporation, by the time of the witch trials, is a different group of people, effectively, much more hardline in religious terms.
And are they at all trying to, I don't know what the term would be, but to kind of cleanse the city of all the badness, of all the old traditions and superstitions? Is this something that they care about, or is it purely about trade?
I think most things do come down to money, don't they, when you boil it down? But I do think there's certainly an element of that. I think there's this huge outpouring of, trying to, as you say, sort of cleanse the town. You've had the plague, God's punishment on a wicked town. Then you've had the Civil War, in which Newcastle stubbornly defended itself but lost. Another sign of God's judgment against the people of the town. And then this corporation takes over, and it's tempting to think of them, trying to kind of purge the wickedness that's caused so much misfortune in the town, and trying to kind of make it a more godly place. I do also wonder, because one of the things that we don't know very much about, sadly, is who these women were really in the Newcastle Witch Trials. We don't have a massive amount of information about them. And I wonder whether it's possible that they are the widows of prominent royalists or supporters, and that there's a political element to the witch trials, where this is trying to get rid of inconvenient people who are perhaps related to some of the people who've died. I mean, some of the names certainly. There's at least one Madison, who are a big family who start out as royalist supporters. Whether she is one of those Madisons or not, we don't know, but she is a Madison in Newcastle, so it's possible. Whether they're trying to get rid of people who, as I say, have maybe inherited the estates or properties of prominent royalists or something like that. I think is another possibility, that these are people who've spoken out against the town corporation, or have been prominent supporters of the other regime. It's politics mixed up with religion, mixed up with superstition. That's quite a melting pot, really. When you put all that together, you've got quite a recipe for something very nasty.
Yeah, but also not too much of a stretch of the imagination, I think. And so we have so many parallels with what's happening in our world today, and seeing how, when those things mix and sort of people come into positions of power, how they can manipulate situations, and suddenly people who are just going about their day are put on trial.
Well, that's it. Yeah, I think. Again, I think you can see those parallels today. A lot of the sort of political instability, and also the power of these kind of conspiracies of these groups. I also think what you see nowadays, and what I think is probably the case back then as well, is that people start out thinking that they can control these things, but that very quickly this kind of thing gets out of anyone's direct control. This is we often talk about witch crazes or witch hysteria, and it is a kind of paranoia, a kind of hysteria that seems to grip areas at particular times, and people become worried that there are witches everywhere, and all of a sudden accusations start to fly and things get very out of hand. And then once things have got out of hand, you can't row back on these things. Once you've gone so far as to lock people up as witches and torture them with pins and things like that, it's you can't really go back then. There are similar witch trials around the same time in England. A little bit earlier, there had been the trials in Essex and East Anglia, led by Matthew Hopkins, who proclaimed himself to be the Witchfinder General of England. Again, under cover of the Civil War, kind of general breakdown in social norms and law and order, was able to travel from village to village, executing people as witches and getting paid for the privilege, which is what the Witchfinder in Newcastle did as well, of course. And I think the Newcastle Witch Trials, and I'm sure some of the people that you've spoken to about witchcraft and things more generally, people like Katie and Joe, would be able to correct me on this, but I think there's a whole 1649, there's a whole spate of witch trials around Berwick, southern Scotland, and parts of Northumberland as well. So there is a general feeling in the region that a group of witch finders, professional witch hunters, are kind of taking advantage of going around the country. I know there are trials in Berwick, and of course in Newcastle, one of the witches executed is Jane Martin, who is from Northumberland, from Chatton. So that it does seem to kind of sweep through the country in like particular areas. It seems to catch hold of people's imaginations, and people grasp onto this idea of witchcraft to give them a focus for their anger or their... It's easy to look back 400 years and be fairly detached about the whole thing, but the plague, a military occupation, followed by an absolutely savage siege of 4 months, followed by another occupation, followed by the entire way that you order society and have done for centuries being completely turned upside down and turned on its head. Lots of religious fervour and things added into that. It's a real time when I think people are undergoing severe trauma. I think that's what we would describe it as. As I say, I don't think people think that differently now than they did then. I think if you put people in very similar situations, they respond in very similar ways. What those ways are is kind of coloured by the wider society that they live in. So, we wouldn't talk about witches so much now. But yeah, I mean, in America, you see it all the time. When natural disasters happen, people, preachers appear on TV saying that it's all the fault of this group or that group, and, kind of blaming it on all sorts of people. God's wrath, it's exactly the same situation. They probably don't talk about witches quite as much, but yeah, I think you really can see why people want that scapegoat. They want those scapegoats for things that are wrong, because it's hard to just say, yes, everything is terrible. And I think that's the case with witches. I mean, witches in the 17th century in England, certainly, I think, and again, Joe and Katie are much more qualified to talk on this. There's less of a sense of conspiracy, I think, in this country. It's more of in Europe, certainly, witchcraft was viewed almost as being like a conspiratorial organisation that you were part of, that was trying to overthrow Christian civilization for the devil. And whereas witches in England, I think, tended to be more individual servants of Satan rather than part of a big conspiracy that met every now and again. But it does have that sense that, these are people who are secretly working against their neighbours. Yeah.
And this is not some history that is probably widely known. Certainly I didn't know so much about the history of Newcastle, so really appreciate you coming and sort of, I guess, giving us a picture of the town, of the people, and what it was like to live there in the city at that time.
Yeah, it's I think it's one of those parts of history that is, I don't know why, but I think in recent years it's kind of fallen out of favour as a bit of history that we concentrate on. I think, even in the 70s, there were films being made about Oliver Cromwell and things like that. So it was very much part of people's general impression of their history. But I think it's very much ignored now, which I think is strange, because it is, a huge constitutional upheaval. I mean, the Civil War has a ripple effect that goes way beyond the actual period of the war and ends up with Britain being a constitutional monarchy as it is now. I mean, the settlement essentially that we've got now is a result of the Civil War, I think, on some level. So it's a massively influential period of history with a lot going on. But yeah, as you say, very little known these days, I think, generally. I mean, people don't change that much. They live in different societies and they live under different conditions, but they are still human beings, and they're responding the way human beings always do. It's worth remembering that when that's another reason to remember it. These were real people going through all of this stuff, and it's, again, at a distance of 400 years, it can be easy to kind of reduce people to being sort of stereotypes, and it can be hard to remember that these were real people the same as us, going about their normal lives, and these events were what were shaping their lives for better and worse. You can see a lot of the places mentioned, I'm sure, in this podcast if you come and visit the castle. The county jail for Northumberland is where Jane Martin was held. It was John Marley's kind of command centre during the siege as well, so you can see graffiti on the walls from the Civil War, the remains of where the cannon were mounted and things like that.
Highly recommend it as a place to visit.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the podcast, and thank you, David, for coming on and talking to us. This has been a very interesting and fascinating talk about Newcastle. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as we did. I'm sure they will. Please find us on social media. Come and say hello. We're on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook as the Newcastle Witches Podcast. So thank you again, and we'll see everyone in the next episode.